looking at the first 8 verses of chapter 3, entitled Judgment of the Gentiles. The restoration of Judah and Jerusalem that God is promising through Joel, that's going to occur in concert with God's judgment on the nations that had in some way ravaged Judah. And that seems to be not an unusual event, that God's restoration includes at the same time judgment on two different groups, of course, but nonetheless they seem to go in concert. Well, let's look at the first 3 verses of Joel 3. For behold, in those days, and at that time, and this is an end times prophecy, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, and then there's what God says he's going to do. I will gather all the nations, that is the Gentiles, bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. Then I will enter into judgment with them there on behalf of my people and my inheritance Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations, and they have divided up my land. They have also cast lots for my people. Notice how many times the word my occurred. God in no way had given up on Judah or even the northern kingdom, Israel, as far as being his people was concerned. And he goes on to say they traded a boy for a harlot and sold a girl for wine that they may drink. In other words, these nations he's referring to had dealt in human merchandise. They bought and sold people. It was a slave trade. Again, my people, my land, my inheritance all go together to imply that Israel was still God's chosen nation in spite of her waywardness. Now, Phoenicia and Philistia are going to be singled out by name in the next few verses. Joel seems to be describing, by the way, something that looks a lot like end times Armageddon. If so, the matters bringing judgment likely occurred during the Great Tribulation, the last 7 years before Christ's return. The valley of Jehoshaphat, by the way, which means God judges, is likely a symbolic name and not the name of any specific valley in Israel. There are valleys all over the place. And by the way, if there's going to be any kind of warfare or battle in Israel, it'll almost certainly take place in a valley of some sort. But this particular case, the valley where God judges, or the valley of decision, we do not know where that will be specifically. So Joel begins with Yahweh challenging the nations as to their purpose in relation to himself. Look at what he says in Joel 3 verse 4. Moreover, what are you to me, O Tyre, Sidon, and all the regions of Philistia? But if you do recompense me swiftly and speedily, in other words, if you bring some action against me, I will return your recompense on your head. God said, whatever you think you've got going against me ain't so, and whatever you try to do, I'm going to turn it right back on your head, give you a taste of your own medicine, and what other sort of phrases you wish to use. Now, both of those coastal regions were known for their slave trade, but here God seemed to challenge them as to their purpose relative to himself. God claimed his justice would repay the oppressors in kind, same kind as they try to deliver. And then it goes on in verse 5, since you have taken my silver and my gold, probably from the houses in Judah, brought my precious treasures to your temples, that would be their castles perhaps, and sold the sons of Judah and Jerusalem to the Greeks in order to remove them far away from their territory. So they sold the sons of Judah as slaves to the Greeks, who would take them far away from the Middle East and get them far away from Israel. So that God's sort of implying that perhaps these nations were intending to reduce the number of people and inhabitants that remained in the land. Joel then laid out the first round description of God's judgment and its promised execution, beginning in verse 7. Behold, I'm going to arouse them. Who are the them? The people that he just spoke of as being sold to the Greeks. He said, the ones that you have taken and sold as slaves, I'm going to arouse them and return your recompense on your head through them. Also, I will sell your sons and your daughters into the hand of the sons of Judah, and they, the Judeans, will sell them to the Sabaeans, to a distant nation, for the Lord has spoken. The Sabaeans would have been Arabs living in what is now Saudi Arabia, south and east of the Dead Sea. In his own sense of justice, God would rouse the captives themselves to be the instruments of retribution, and the result to be in true lex talionis fashion. Lex talionis was the law of retaliation. It was intended to limit, for example, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and so on. So God says, whatever you do to Judah is precisely what I will do to you. And so he says, you sold my people into slavery and dispersed them widely from their homeland. My people will do the same to your sons and daughters. Now the Sabaeans again were Arabs from the land now known as Saudi Arabia, which is a good long walk from Israel. By the way, Joel sounds like he is describing something Paul mentioned in Romans. In Romans 11, verses 25 and 26, Paul says this, for I do not want you, brethren, he's writing to the Roman Christians, of course, to be uninformed of this mystery, lest you be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, and thus all Israel will be saved. Just as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion, he will remember ungodliness, he will remove ungodliness from Jacob. And in Micah 4:11 and 12. And now many nations have been assembled against you, who say, let her be polluted, and let our eyes gloat over Zion, that would be Judah. but they do not know the thoughts of Yahweh. They do not understand his purpose, for he has gathered them like sheaves to the threshing floor. So the gathering of the nations is for their judgment, not for their victory, conquering, and so forth. It will not be a good time for those nations. Next, Joel's going to give us a more in-depth look at the proposed judgment of those nations. Now, this was a very short session, and the next 1 or 2 sessions to finish up Joel will probably also be relatively short sessions. So get ready, be here next time, and we will see how Joel continues to describe what's on tap for the nations who have ravaged Judah. We'll see you then. Thank you.